Artemij Troitskij, en rysk journalist och musikkritiker, och Eugene Wolynsky. Det är Föreningen Ordfront som arrangerar. Välkomna upp på scenen.
Hej.
Hello everybody, my name is Eugene Wolynsky. I am working with Ordfront, who is arranging this conversation now about the Bolotnaja protests, Bolotnaja prisoners, and the situation with freedom of speech and freedom of expression in Russia after the Bolotnaja protests and after the Bolotnaja prisoners were arrested. And Ordfront is doing Bolotnaja campaign for the political prisoners in Russia at all, not only Bolotnaja prisoners, but all other prisoners also. We have the information about our Bolotnaja campaign that you can get afterwards, maybe in our monitor or somewhere else. I just wanted to say, why are we doing Bolotnaja campaign in Ordfront? Because we want to mention that after Bolotnaja, the democracy in Russia was disappearing totally. Like before Bolotnaja protest, it was at least democracy on paper. But after Bolotnaja, it's a dictature, it's new dictator laws, it's new political repressions, it's new political prisoners, and all the freedom is decreasing, and that's we will talk about. And now we have Artemij Troitskij here. He is a music journalist and now a protest journalist, a living legend in Russia, and he was supporting and talking about the protest in Russia in last 3 years. So I want to ask you, Artemij, your experience from demonstrations, Bolotnaja demonstrations, other demonstrations in Moscow from December 2011 when it began, and then up to May 2012. You were following all of them, and as a journalist, do you see any difference like between how it was demonstration in that period and how it's now?
Hey. Well, first of all, I would like to explain you what Bolotnaja is. Bolotnaja is the name of a square. It's just a square in the very center of Moscow, across the river from the Kremlin. Bolota in Russian means swamp. So it's a very old swampy square where they used to execute prisoners in the 18th century and before it. But then it became a very popular place for Russian opposition to get together. So we've started to have all those meetings and rallies in Bolotnaya Ploshchad since December 2011. There was the very first one on December 10th, 2011, after the elections to the Russian parliament. State Duma have been forged, and there were, I think, about 70 to 80,000 people, a lot. The protests in Russia, they are quite different from, say, at the very same time, they've had Occupy Wall Street protests in America. They've also had the so-called Spring Revolutions in the Arabic countries in North Africa. And of course, there's been a lot of comparisons. But I must tell you that what was going on in Russia has nothing to do with those two other types of mass protest, because economic agenda didn't take any place in Russia. All those mass manifestations that we've had, they only had humanitarian slogans. So all these slogans were about freedom of speech, freedom in general, honest elections, no corruptions, and so on. So no slogans like, for instance, we want more employment, or give us more money, and we want more jobs, and so on. You know, the slogans which prevailed in America and which prevailed in Southern Africa and the Middle East. So it was basically a middle-class revolt, a middle-class moral and humanitarian revolt against an oppressive and corrupted state. And Putin's state is definitely very oppressive, and absolutely it's corrupted to the core. Now, the first several big manifestations in December 2011, then in February 2012, they've been absolutely peaceful. They've been peaceful also because I think the authorities, they have been quite disorientated about what was going on. They were not used to that amount of people to take streets and squares of Moscow. So they behaved rather quietly. But after Putin has been, again, in a very dodgy way, has been elected a president in March 2012, the powers, especially the so-called siloviki, by which I mean the police and all the kind of Moscow forces of the Russian government, they started to behave in a much more brutal way. And this was the story in Bolotnaja Square on May 6, 2012. Where an absolutely peaceful demonstration, I was there, and it was, you know, people were, of course, absolutely unarmed, and the weather was exactly like it is in Gothenburg today. So it was warm and nice and sunny, and a lot of people, they were with kids, so it didn't look at all as a violent demonstration. Yeah. But everything was packed with police. Everything was packed with so-called OMON, which is special forces, special riot forces, who we call cosmonauts because, you know, they all wear helmets and they look like some monsters from outer space. So there were thousands of them. Maybe this manifestation, it hasn't been so big as the ones in winter. I think there were about 40 to 50,000 people, and there were, I think, no less than 10,000 of police forces, and they have crossed all the streets, all the bridges, and they started to provoke people. And when they provoked people, of course, you know, they started to react to it. Yeah. Yes, please.
I thought, like as you mentioned, that it was very different people. At Bolotnaja, it was people with children, it was politically active people, some politically non-active people who maybe came for the first time and so on. But then the Bolotnaja prisoners, these 30 persons who are imprisoned now, they represent very different slices of Russian society. Like there is some liberals, there are anarchists, there are some left people, it were some just business people who were arrested and non-political active. Do we have a right to understand it that way, that it was different messages to the different groups of society, like don't think freely, don't behave as you want, you should.
Well, I think that, you know, for me it doesn't really matter whether they were anarchists or liberals or communists or whatever. For me, a more important thing is that they belong to all kinds of social stratas and all kinds of ages. So among those who were in Bolotnaja Square and those who were arrested, they were everyone from teenagers to pensioners. I mean, a couple of people who they have arrested, they were pensioners. They were over 60 years old. Men and women. Both political activists, but a minority of them have been political activists. Mostly very, very ordinary people, men and women who belonged, you know, to, you can call it middle class, you can call it creative class. Some of them have been politically engaged. Some they simply went there because, you know, because they hate Putin, basically, you know, like every normal person in Russia. And the message that has been sent by the authorities towards everyone is basically that we don't care who you are. You can be a teenager, or you can be an old man or old woman, but if you dare to do something against the state, you will be ruthlessly stopped and put to trial and put to prison. And everyone knows that court in Russia doesn't really exist. You know, it's called a court, but it's not a court because there's no justice. There's absolutely no justice in this court, and the judges, they just make the verdicts that they are sent from above. So they never let the prisoners out. They put them all in jail, and they give them rather severe punishment.
Yeah, I think if we compare the demonstrations 2012, 2011 also, and the demonstrations what are going now. So we see that at that time the language of the slogans was quite obscene and strong. It was directed towards Putin. Is it possible today?
Well, the situation now has changed, and it's now much less fun than it used to be. I mean, I remember the first big manifestations, and they all looked like carnivals. You know, people came in their thousands, and they wore very funny slogans. They wore pieces of art. They were, you know, I think that they were basically having fun, and they ridiculed Putin's dictatorship and their greed and corruption and all that. After this big battle in Bolotnaja Square, and after a lot of people have been arrested and put to trial and put to jail and so on, of course, a lot of people they felt far less funky than.
So you mean it's just less reason for fun
than before? So now, you know, I've been at the very last manifestation in Moscow, in Mariana. This was like a week ago. It was exactly last Sunday. Yes, on Sunday, the 20th of September. And now you know, the atmosphere is quite different. It's much more serious. It's a little bit sad, and it's unfortunately it's more careful, because now people understand that everything is shot on video. You know how they picked up those people who they're arrested
at Rysk group
at Bolotnaja. You know, they've had a lot of video footage, and by this video footage they identified people, and then they found them and arrested them. So, and now they know that everything is being filmed on video, from the helicopters, you know, from the ground, from everywhere. So people now are far more careful than there used to be, and so it's not as much fun as it was before. and the costumes are also not as funny.
One of Bolotnaya prisoners, Alexei Gaskarov, he was writing from prison that after the Olympics in Sochi, the authorities thought to release Bolotnaya prisoners maybe, but then Maidan began, and so they decided that if Bolotnaya prisoners are released and Maidan is going on, that's a message to the population that you can beat cops. So that's why they stayed in prison, and then Bolotnaya process risking to be quite eternal because of this video group and so on. Do you think it's some connection between Bolotnaya prisoners' destiny and the processes in Ukraine?
I don't think so. Well, of course, there is some kind of symbolic connection, but I personally, my own point of view is that such things as Maidan in the Ukraine are not possible in Moscow, because the crowd in Kiev, the crowd in the Ukraine was very serious. They came to Maidan and they wanted to stay there. In Moscow, in Russia, it's much more easy. They come, they make speeches, and then they go home or go to the neighboring bars and restaurants and drink to death to Putin.
What does it depend on? Is it because of?
I think it's a national character. It's the national tradition. I cannot really tell you, but I think that what's going on in Ukraine and what's going on in Russia are two different things. This is my opinion, and the message for the outside world, including Sweden, is very simple. Russia is a dictatorship. This is not a democratic country. Just forget it. Russia has political prisoners. People who are innocent but who are thrown to jail because of their political beliefs, because of their political behavior, nothing else. They are not criminals, they are even not hooligans. Yeah. And this must be understood. And of course, you in Sweden, you have some experiences with Russian submarines. But of course, besides submarines, there's also many other nasty things that Russia is capable of. And I think that people in Europe must be really aware of the current regime. You shouldn't expect nothing good from it. And when they talk about we are going to stop the war in Syria, this is a joke. They will never do it. They are liars, and they are absolutely cynical about whatever they try to do.
Okay, last question, maybe a bit unpopular. What is your prognosis? What do you think will happen to Russia like in 10, 20 years? Do you see Russia in the same borders, or do you see some other Russia? Do you think this regime is forever, or when it falls?
No. I think that Putin regimes will fall very soon, because I've made a discovery that there is a cycle, a 30-year cycle in Russia. So the 50s in Russia are like the 80s and like the 10s. And what does it mean? The 50s, they began with Stalin still in power, and it was really awful. Then Stalin, thank God, he passed away, and it was much better, and we've had the de-Stalinization, Khrushchev thaw, Sputnik, Gagarin, and so on. So it was nice. So the decade started very badly, but finished very nicely. Then it was like the 80s. The 80s also, the beginning of the 80s, the agony of the Soviet regime, the war in Afghanistan, nothing in the shops, and so on. Totally dark. Then, of course, Gorby came, and there was perestroika and glasnost. So the 80s, they have finished very, very nicely. So this decade, the 10th of the 21st century, belongs to the same cycle. So they have began very badly, awful time right now. But we believe, and I personally believe, that very soon there will be a crack, and the regime will be swept down the drain, and Putin will be put on trials in The Hague. And the guys from Bolotnaja Square will perform as witnesses.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Artemij Troitskij.
Tack så hemskt mycket för detta. Vår sista